Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of Notes on Ningyo. My name is Alan Scott Pate, and this series began as we began our lockdown under COVID, and we quickly cranked out about 15 of these episodes, one a week. And since then, I went on a little hiatus. If you've noticed, we haven't published a new one for a while, but I have not been idle. Published a new book. Been lecturing extensively now that things have loosened up a little bit. And so I thought it was about time to turn back and publish another or post another edition of Notes on Ningyo. And this week, episode 16, we are looking at good, better, and best, the way to evaluate Ichimatsu-ningyo. Now, this idea comes to me because far too frequently, people say, well, they all look alike. I really don't like that phrase, they all look alike, because they aren't. But what this tells me, or they don't look alike, but what this tells me is that as of yet, most people really haven't learned how to dial in and to look at these dolls and see them individually, to look at qualities and characteristics that differentiate one doll from another. When you first glance at them, there may be a sense of sameness, hair style, or the fact that they're wearing a kimono. But in point of fact, they're all so unique. And as you begin to look at them individually, as you break down the groups and start calling them out and looking at them individually, suddenly you start seeing or are able to tune in more to their individuality. Sometimes a group is helpful because you could do a cross comparison, but sometimes you lose focus and are not really looking at the individual. But as we get down to the individual dolls, start looking at their kimono, the quality of their kimono, the condition of their kimono, looking at their faces, how well they're modeled, their hair, their hands, and even their feet. We begin to start to develop skills and tools for critical evaluation of these dolls, so that when we come across Ichimatsu, we're able to look at them with a little bit more of an educated eye, coming at it from more of a knowledge base rather than just like, well, there's a Japanese doll, whatever. And so this talk, Good, Better, Best, is going to break down and give you some really, hopefully some practical information on how to accomplish this sort of vetting process, if you will. So many Ichimatsu are available on sites like eBay or what have you. And frequently people just don't know what to do with them, whether they're fantastic, good, better, best, or even if they're gomi. Gomi is the Japanese word for, well, garbage. So, you have the gomikata, the types that are more gomi, all the way up. And so how do we filter these in a more fine-tuned way? And that's the goal of today. Good, better, best. So some of this appears in my recently published book, Ichimatsu, Japanese Play Dolls, cover shown here. And hopefully this talk will inspire you to want to delve more deeply into Ichimatsu, its history, culture, and the artisans that make it such an exciting form. And this book is available on my website and also on Amazon. We'll get to that a little bit later. But let's just go in. So we're going to look at good, better, best evaluation, but we're going to have to start off with condition issues, because this is our initial triage. When we look at a doll, before we get too much into its base quality, we have to, is the condition acceptable? In terms of textiles, the biggest problem for Japanese dolls made of silk, frequently with not synthetic dyes, more natural dyes, is sun and fading. And so here, for example, is a kimono taken from a friendship doll. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we'll be dealing more with the friendship dolls in detail in just a little bit. This comes from Miss Nagoya, who is stored at the Atlanta History Center, not too far from where I live here in Georgia. For many years, several decades now actually, she has been stored and separately from her original kimono. So this is her original Chirimen silk crepe kimono, absolutely extraordinary, but you can see that sunlight during the years that she was on display took its toll. And so you have patches where you have the original color that's nice and rich, but then you can also see where the sun has bleached it to sort of a uniform tan, if you will. It's unfortunate. But this is the type of thing that happens with kimono on Ichimatsu with some frequency. And I, as a general rule, tend not to invest or spend much time with ningyo that have faded kimono. Now, of course, Miss Nagoya, friendship doll, that's a whole other story and worth every element, even if the kimono is faded. But as you get into more commercial ningyo, there's enough out there that I tend, unless a significant doll for one reason or another, I tend to pass over dolls that have too much fading in their kimono and move on to dolls that have a better condition on that front. So a faded kimono, an intensely faded kimono, usually is a no-go for me, and I move right along. So the next element that we have to discuss is, and some of you will be familiar, is that all of the skin surfaces on many traditional ningyo, Japanese dolls, are made of a material called gofun, which is a crushed oyster shell and animal glue. And it's powdered shell mixed with a Nikawa glue and is applied meticulously, layer upon layer. Some of the base layers are used to help sculpt and form some of the actual facial structure, the physiognomy of the doll, whether that's the eyelids or the philtrum or the lips or the fullness of the cheek even. But gofun is water soluble, and therefore it cannot be cleaned like, say, a French bisque doll. You can't take a little bit of water on a rag and wipe. You've stripped off decades or if not centuries of gofun immediately. And so a soiled, dirty gofun surface on a doll is frequently also a no-go for me, unless, of course, the doll is significant. Similarly, cracking. Now, gofun, because it is applied over a core base, typically in the case of Ichimatsu, that's a wood composite or toso. The gofun it works like an eggshell over that toso, and depending upon environmental conditions, this substrata of toso could expand and contract, causing stress on the gofun to have expansion cracks as well. And sometimes when those cracks are along the seam by the ear, it's a natural thing, I can overlook it, but if it shows up mid-cheek, mid-face, that's difficult. So here, for example, this is another friendship doll, Miss Ishikawa, located in Helena, Montana. You can see there's a fairly significant crack on her lower left cheek. That's not a seam crack, that's right through the surface, and that would be a very, very difficult endeavor to fix. So if you have a crack like that, you can't really invest in the repair process, and so I tend to ignore those as well or pass over. Faded kimono, cracks and soiling typically are no-go. However, every now and then repair needs to be done, and it can happen with dolls. So this is Kenji, Iwamura Kenji. He's a second generation, very important ningyo maker in his own right, but also he's become a go-to for restoration of high-quality ningyo, particularly the friendship dolls. And so he was called upon to help restore Miss Gunma, one of the friendship dolls, when she was discovered. And so in these images, you can see what she looked like up there in the upper left. It has a crack near her eye, soiled gofun. Someone had overpainted her lips. And so for Kenji-san to do this, he literally had to take off the hair wig. We'll get into that into a minute. Disassemble the head into two sections, strip away layers of gofun to get behind the crack, below the crack, and then build up the gofun again, reassemble the head, and then reapply the hair wig or a new hair wig. As you can see, this is not a simple process, and therefore, for most dolls, just not even worth, it's financially just not feasible, unless, again, the doll is worth it, like a friendship doll. Miss Guma certainly is worth it. Now she's at the Morikami Museum in Delray Beach, Florida, happily resuming her duties. But the hair wig, I see French dolls and people scrutinizing a French doll, and they'll rip the hair wig right off to get a look at the head. And I'm horrified, because if you try to do that with a Japanese doll, well, you can't, because they are glued firmly in place. So here, another friendship doll. They're very handy to use for illustrative purposes. This is by Hirata Goyo, the Miss Nagano, or the original Miss Aichi, as she was discovered in an estate sale, lacking her original hair wig, and also lots of issues with the gofun. But of course, a Goyo friendship doll, we'll get into Hirata Goyo later, clearly worth the restoration. And here's Kenji-san holding a hair wig that's been removed, just to show how difficult a process it is to replace the hair, unlike French dolls. So with this in mind, now we're going to start looking at faces, and then we'll go to hands, and then we'll go to feet, just in terms to start getting a little bit of a grip, a little bit of a handle on how to evaluate what are we actually looking at and what are the qualities that we're looking for. So I'm going to start off with this beautiful girl by Okoku. I love this artist, a 1930s Tokyo-based artist. I think that he had a really special way of handling gofun. I find his gofun to have a luster to it, a richness to it, a vitality to it that I find quite striking. His eyes tend to be a little bit heavy-lidded. Carving skills really quite fine. But as you look at it, a little sharp edges, a little bit less sophisticated in terms of how some of these features are realized. His menso, or the painting of the face, a little heavy on the eyebrows. These are things that you start looking at. This is a very good face, an exceptionally good face. But I think that Okoku's skill sets was not quite as high, or at least as evidenced on this doll, not quite top flight. So love this doll, very solid, good doll. But let's shift over to a doll by Iwamura Shokensai. The first, this is Kenji-san's father, the individual that I mentioned doing the repair work. This was a doll made by his father. And I find this doll to be just lovely. In terms of the facial modeling, you can see how the eyes are a little bit more open, and yet there's more of a suggestion of a lower lid, and how it's situated into the face. It's less flat. It sort of has a fullness, a full realization of how the eye sits on the face. The painting of the eyebrows are nice and light, feathered inward. Lips very well done, standing out more from the surface of the face. Again, all of this would have been done through the modeling of gofun. His menso painting, just really quite fine. I love the tonality of the lips, the wrinkles or the folds, the creases within the lips. And then again, as you look at this image of her left profile, you can see the chin, the crease in the chin and the fullness of the cheeks. And so Shokensai, Iwamura Shokensai, a very significant artist, and we'll get into him as an individual artist in a little bit more later in the talk. But a very much better, in our chain of hierarchy, good, better, best. This is a better face than the Okoku for the reasons I just mentioned. So let's move to what might be considered a best face. And frequently, to illustrate best, I turn to Hirata Goyo, second generation, Hirata Goyo Nidai. Hirata Goyo, we'll get into his biography a little bit later, but exceptional artist on every level. Not only as Ichimatsu, but the Ichi-ningyo living dolls. He did Boys' Day dolls, and then, of course, his famous Sosaku, or art dolls of the 1930s. And this was a beautiful Ichimatsu girl done by Goyo in the mid-30s. And again, all of that, the lustrousness of the gofun, the softness of the features, well done. The edges around, like the flare of the nose, not quite so sharp as Shokensai and Okoku. Goyo was known for using eyes that were literally like fake eyes, or eyes that would have been almost medical grade glass eyes. So there's a full roundness and a sophistication to them as he applied those to his ningyo. Here she also has eyelashes, another level of a higher, just sort of a little bit more quality going into it. And of course, famous for his menso painting and the feathered inward eyebrows. But a lovely girl. In terms of just Ichimatsu. This is the utter depiction of a high quality Ichimatsu. So if we do a comparison of our good, better, best, we have Okoku, Shokensai, and Goyo. And I'll leave it to you to look and start getting a handle what you think differentiates one from another. I love all of these dolls. I think they're all fabulous dolls, but one good, one better, one best. And so that's sort of how we're going to approach this as we move through looking at different components. So this was a section dealing with face. And of course, we focused on girl faces, but the boys' faces immediately can, the same skills, the same criteria, if you will, could be applied. The hair for the boys frequently painted, so you have to look at the detail of that, the painted hair versus the silk or the human hair wigs. But they come in all sizes and all styles. But the skills, the basic criteria for evaluation stays the same for boy and or girl. So we'll mix it up a little bit in terms of the dolls that we present, girl, boy. Hands are our next level. Frequently on the top flight dolls, these artists that made the head also made the hands, but not always the case. Sometimes the main artist would make the heads, but his disciples or those studying under him, his deshi would be responsible for making the hands. And so looking at the hands is another level of quality, another sort of way to evaluate. So here's a sweet little boy by Kyuzan. Kyuzan, famous or known for his katako or Chinese style boys. So that's the hairstyle you see with the pom-poms on the side and the tassels and that type of thing. That's called, that's called a katako or Chinese boy style. And his hands, so we'll take a look at face again, lovely gofun. But when we look at his hands, the fingers are delineated, very important, because when you get to the gomi level or the lowest level of dolls, they tend to be kind of club-like and no differentiation of fingers, no separation of thumb almost. And so with Kyuzan, we do see clear delineation of fingers. We see a little plumpness in the back of the hand, which I find very good. So this is an indication of a good hand to go along with a good doll. Kyuzan was a very good doll artist, but not known for making the top flight dolls. So here is a lovely girl from the Kyoto atelier of Maruhei Okihaso, and we'll get into the difference between makers and atelier and department stores and that type of thing a little bit later. But this is a kotobuki or a top level by Maruhei, and if we look at her hands, we see that same plumpness of the back of the hand, but now we see very well delineated fingernails, knuckles, creases. These kinds of details are definitely a sign of bumping up a level in terms of quality. And so this is a fine example from Kyoto Maruhei, and a beautiful example. And so this is a better doll than the Kyuzan. And then finally, again, going to a friendship doll, we're looking at Miss Osaka Fu at the Historical Center in Columbus, Ohio. And look at the hands done by Hirata Goyo. Absolutely, practically lifelike. You can feel the pulse within that hand. The naturalness of how the fingers are slightly flexed, the details on the fingernails, the in-painting, the separation between thumb and the index finger, all of that is just so incredibly lifelike. And this speaks to Goyo's training. He cut his teeth making hyper-realistic dolls, and so he was able to bring these skill sets to Ichimatsu. And that's one of the reasons why the 5 dolls that Goyo made for the Friendship Doll Project were conceived and seen as being the highest of all that were made. And the Ichimatsu that he made for the private sector following tend to be of just a superlative quality. And so this hand really speaks to that level of artistry that Goyo was able to bring to his Ichimatsu when he so chose. So good, better, best. Here is our Kyuzan, our Maruhei girl in the middle, and then Hirata Goyo on the right. And so you can spend a little time yourself looking at the 3 hands and comparing finger separation, flexion, plumpness, vitality, if you will, in the 3 hands. So good, better, best. Now, just as hands were not always made by the main artist, feet as well sometimes were relegated to deshi, sometimes done by the artist. And so it helps us to look at feet as well. Now, prior to 1927 and the Friendship Doll Exchange, most Ichimatsu were not depicted wearing tabi socks. So they were depicted barefoot, and therefore artists had to lavish more or spend some attention on the feet, whereas later, covered in tabi, you can hide a multitude of sins underneath those tabi. But during the Taisho era and prior to the friendship doll exchange, and also in the Meiji era, of course, very rarely were tabi socks on the feet. And so here is a beautiful early Taisho example by Togyoku, distributed actually through Daimaru department store. We'll get into Daimaru in a little bit. But you can see the hands, well separated fingers, but also that the feet follow that same sort of format. Not much effort to delineate nails, or toenails, or creases, but nice delineation, nice sense of plumpness, that type of thing. But a good hand, good feet. Good foot, but not the same quality that we saw earlier with the hands of Goyo and Shokensai. So here, let's revisit that Shokensai girl, the face on the right there, and how wonderful that is. And then also the hand that we've sort of broken down a little bit. Then now look at the feet. Now she's wearing, I took off the tabi sock for this photograph, and you can see there's a big gap between the big toe and the rest of the toes so that the tabi can slide onto there. But you can see, similarly to the hands, detail on the toenails, detail on creases, that type of thing. So a step up, a better interpretation of foot. Now, let's go to another artist, Koryusai, Takizawa Koryusai, second generation. We'll get into him a little bit more later. Another Taisho era piece. Now, Taisho era is from 1912 to 1926. So this is from the 19 teens, early 1920s, not designed for tabi sock. A beautiful boy doll, well done face. But look at his feet, how natural they are. The toenail so well done. How there's a nice curvature to the toes. They're not stiff and static. And having a slight profile of the foot, you can see the pad of the foot is well done. Just overall, a lot of vitality and a lot of life-likeness to Koryusai's interpretation here. And so I love this doll for that reason. So good, better, best. Togyoku girl on the left, Shokensai in the middle, and then a Koryusai on the right with his very naturalistic foot. Good, better, best. So the same sort of thing we saw with hands, we can apply to feet. Now, textiles. Now, Japanese textiles are famous the world over, and there's absolutely no way that I can give in any kind of reasonable breakdown all the different weaves and techniques and dyes and patterns and supplemental embroidery and all the things that make Japanese textiles a world unto themselves. But you do find them in nearly every guise displayed on Ichimatsu-ningyo. And for many people, it's the textiles that are the hook, not only with Ichimatsu, but Japanese ningyo in general. I, for one, love the textiles and have been drawn to that. But when we're evaluating the textiles, not all textiles are created equal. I mean, fading aside, that we have to start looking at the base quality. So here's a beautiful Ichimatsu girl, silk textile, but with a printed silk textile. Very little fading. Now, one will also notice very, very quickly that the Japanese traditionally are not shy about some stunning, eye-popping color combination, purples and oranges and greens and lavenders right alongside with reds and blues. Can be a little jarring, but at the same time, it evokes its own sense of the Japanese mastery of pattern, color. And so this is a very good textile, but printed on silk. Now compare that to another Togyoku doll, and here she's wearing a beautiful, rich purple chirimen silk crepe, but dyed through a Yuzen stencil dye pattern. So this is more hand done. Individual shading of the blossoms, a little bit of supplemental embroidery there at the center of the chrysanthemums. So there is a higher level of sophistication, not only in terms of the base material. Here it is a chirimen silk crepe, but also in terms of how the design is executed on the silk. So chirimen was the go-to Silk crepe was the go-to for many Ichimatsu-ningyo, and sometimes they were just called chirimen-ningyo because of that. But chirimen, not all chirimen created equal, and you have yuzen-dyed chirimen, but you also have different other elements that go into it. So chirimen was one of the higher grades of textiles applied to the Ichimatsu form. So here is a better textile, the doll by Togyoku wearing a yuzen chirimen kimono. Now, for our best, I've chosen one of a pair. Actually, this is from a pair of Ichimatsu, boy-girl pair, by Hirata Yoko. Yoko is Hirata Goyo's younger brother, famous as an Ichimatsu maker in his own right, and fittingly, with the high quality of his carving, high quality of his renderings, the textiles frequently are quite high level. So here we have a figured silk with a beautiful dye, a some dyed pattern, but with extensive supplemental embroidery, and rather than generic floral bursts, which is arguably the most common thing that you will find. Here we actually have a scene of a cart, an ox cart by a pond with a pavilion, just a lovely, almost a narrative feel to this kimono, all on the figured silk. And an extensive amount of supplemental embroidery. We can see that the dye here is a little bit of an aniline, so the pink is really pink, a little jarring there, but very much in keeping with the 30s, and a beautiful, beautiful figured weave, figured silk kimono with a beautiful dye pattern and supplemental embroidery. So again, for our comparison, we have our printed silk on the left, we have our yuzen chirimen in the middle, and then we have a figured silk with supplemental dye and patterning and embroidery on the right. Good, better, best. Very helpful, actually, in evaluating. Now, I've mentioned a number of artists, but how do you know who the doll is by? You can look at qualities, you can look at things, but sometimes, you really need to see who they're by. Sometimes we have information, sometimes we don't. So as Ichimatsu began to develop in the late 1900s, not all makers, craftsmen at that point, signed their dolls. Frequently they came in a wood storage box, and better doll makers sometimes put their name on that back. This is by Takeuchi Masujiro, a very, very important late Meiji, early Taisho maker. And this is a doll, a large-scale Ichimatsu in its original box with his signature on the inside, showing us that this is by Takeuchi Masujiro. But you can see that on the doll itself, there is no signature. But as time went forward, we moved through the Taisho era, again through the teens and the 20s, of standardization of what's called the signature cloth emerged. So here again, we're revisiting this beautiful koryusai boy that we used earlier as an example for his foot. Now his kimono is open, and you can see the signature cloth there and the somewhat faded signature of Takizawa koryusai and his seal, his rakan there. And so this tells us that this particular doll was definitely made by Takizawa koryusai, and based on the quality, a very, very fine example. Also, again, large scale, high, like 28, 29 inches, I believe this doll is, so quite large, and one of a pair as well. Now, doll makers frequently worked with atelier in various cities around Japan. So they may have been made in Tokyo, but they then would have been shipped off to atelier, who then would have dressed and marketed them under their own name. And in Kyoto, we have a number of important atelier, and an important early atelier was the Namikawa Ningyo-ten. Now, Namikawa was famous for high quality, a supplier to the imperial family, high quality hina, high quality ichimatsu, and particularly the dogu, or the accessories that went with the hina, made of silver and very fine lacquer work. So Namikawa was a top flight supplier to the imperial family, and therefore the dolls that come through Namikawa tend to be of a very high quality, but it's very difficult to know which artist, what specific artisan made the dolls. So here we have a beautiful, I love this particular, the expression on this face, very wide-eyed. So this is a Taisho era, so maybe late 19 teens, early 20s possible. Very broad eyes, A little bit reminiscent of Togyoku, but since we don't know, there's no signature Togyoku, we can't say. But here is the when the doll is opened or the kimono taken off. This is the Namikawa label that one will find, and frequently with this superimposed sticker of a little gosho there in color, also frequently found on Namikawa, but not invariably. But it's that light sort of bluish blue-green seal that you would look for to let you know that that's specifically a Namikawa piece. So I mentioned a Daimaru department store earlier, and this is a beautiful little boy done in the Karuko style. And you can see, again, no artist name, but this is a tokusei or special product with the Daimaru label. So it's the character Dai, meaning great within a circle. So it's the Daimaru Gofukuten store, department store, and a tokusei. So that's not a signature. That just indicates a special product there in the middle. Daimaru, one of a trio or quartet of important department stores that began in the Edo period, Takashimaya, Matsuzakaya. These department stores went on to become very, very important in the late Meiji and early Taisho era, and they made the jump from traditional clothing stores and dry goods stores into a modern department store. And so here is a woodblock print showing Daimaru up in Tokyo or Edo at that point in the early 1800s, and then the shop in Kyoto as it's built in a very modern building there in the 1930s when that doll that we've been looking at would have been done. Sometimes you try and swim upstream and say, well, if a doll looks like this and it's from a department store, maybe we can figure out who did it. And yes, it's possible, but it's also quite challenging. So the doll that we're looking at, Daimaru, the tokusei piece that was sold through Daimaru, the most notable characteristic is that it's done in the Karuko style, but a number of artisans working in the 1930s did the Karuko style. Kunihana was one. Kyuzan, the figure that we've looked at earlier, also did a number of boys for the popular doing the Karuko style, but then also Shofu. Shofu frequently did boys in Karuko style, but just because it's done in a Karuko hairstyle doesn't let us specifically know what doll maker did supply this particular doll for Daimaru. So in these cases, we just have to say, well, it's a great doll from Daimaru. So Maruhei Okihaso atelier, I mentioned earlier, was probably the premier Ningyo atelier in Kyoto. I use the past tense because Maruhei Okihaso unfortunately has now closed shop after multiple generations supplying to the imperial family. Hina, Gosho, and of course Ichimatsu of the highest caliber came through Maruhei's store. Like Namikawa that we mentioned before and Daimaru, Maruhei marketed the dolls through their own name. And so it's very, very difficult to know, except for certain pieces, rare pieces, exactly who the artist is. But fortunately, Maruhei had a very sophisticated labeling system. So here was a beautiful pair, 1930s Ichimatsu pair by Maruhei, showing their original boxes and the label that Maruhei placed in his boxes, which help us date this very, very readily to the late 1930s. But when you take off the kimono and look underneath, for the signature cloth, we don't find a signature. Much like Daimaru and Namikawa, we find the Maruhei mark, that circle up top with Kyoto written above it in superscript, that this is the Kyoto shop Maruhei. And the middle section is a qualitative marker, not an artist marker, jurushi. So the one on the left is sort of a base quality, sort of an introductory level Maruhei doll jurushi. The next one is the Matsu, which is the pine level. So that would be a level up. And then following that is Take, which is the bamboo level. And then the final one there in yellow is Kotobuki Jurushi, which is their very special make. And so these are the general 4 graded levels that one finds on a Maruhei doll to indicate the quality of the doll. But again, very difficult to gainsay what artist made the dolls. So frequently, Maruhei was sourcing his Ichimatsu from artists up in Tokyo, but then dressing them and marketing them under his name. It says, as a small aside, dolls, Tokyo-made dolls were known as Azuma-ningyo, Azuma being another name for the Kanto area where Tokyo is based. So Azuma-ningyo are Ichimatsu in Tokyo. And kyo-ningyo is how Ichimatsu were referred to once they were dressed and marketed down in Kyoto area. Same doll, but just the clothing being done and sometimes stylistic considerations for the Kyoto market. So Azuma-ningyo, kyo-ningyo, all of these referring to Ichimatsu, but basically Ichimatsu as a form is a Tokyo art form, Tokyo artisanal form. Maruhei, as I alluded to earlier, also has this added element where his boxes have his labels, and from his labels we can get a good sense of dating. On the far left we have late Edo, early Meiji era, so from the mid 1800s to 1870, 1860, 1870 Maruhei label. Next, sort of a early Meiji era label, so beginning more toward the latter half of the 19th century, and then very late Meiji, early Taisho is that next label, and then the final label on the far right is a label that came into play in the 1930s, and that's the same label that we saw earlier on that pair. So Maruhei Okihaso. Now, a related atelier, related in the sense that they served a similar function, but very, very separate and somewhat rivalrous, is Yoshitoku. Now, Yoshitoku I mentioned with great frequency, particularly in conjunction with the friendship dolls, because they were very much involved in that whole process and continue to be in terms of restoration and that type of thing. Unlike Maruhei in Kyoto, Yoshitoku approached their dolls a little bit differently. Being based in Tokyo, they work very much hand in hand with the Tokyo Azuma-ningyo makers. And so here we have a picture of the Yoshitoku main store in the Meiji era. That's the black and white photograph up above. And then now Yoshitoku on the exact same site. That's the exact same location, but in their relatively recently rebuilt building, which houses their offices and gallery and a museum. And so hopefully if you go to Tokyo, you will visit Yoshitoku dolls there in Tokyo. With its museum, it's an amazing repository of history, and also they have so many wonderful ningyo on sale that rotates out seasonally. But what Yoshitoku excelled at, if you will, is marketing. And they, in the 1930s and early 1940s, published a whole series of catalogs in which you could go through and actually shop for your dolls. They frequently sold them hadaka, or naked. And here is one of the catalogs, I believe this is from 1941, that shows some of the ningyo that they were marketing, or some of the makers that they were marketing at that time. So on the upper left there, you have Harukoma. Next to that, you have Gyokusui, Ryugetsu, Wakaba, Okura, Okuni, Taiko, Kunimitsu, Shoryuzai. These were sort of middling makers, good because they came through Yoshitoku, but not the most expensive. In contrast, on the right, we have a page featuring very, very specifically Ningyo by Hirata Goyo Nidai. Again, the top apex predator, if you will, within the ningyo world. And if you sort of dial in and look at the price tags here, for the cheapest dolls on the right, you have them for just basically pennies, and then you get over to some of the finer dolls by Goyo, and they're up to 300 and something yen, which is a multiple 300 times the value of the dolls on the opposite page. So again, this is helping us to also see how the Japanese evaluated the dolls, because there was a price hierarchy. There was a price leveling. Certain dolls would not command a Goyo price, and you couldn't get a Goyo doll for, let's say, a Gyokusui price. And so these catalogs are very, very instrumental in helping us to see, in general, how the various artists were evaluated by the Japanese themselves. So let's dial in a little bit more closely to some of these artists quite specifically. And I frequently start with the Friendship Doll Exchange of 1927, in that this is, bar none, the most seminal event to ever take place in the history of the development of Ichimatsu-ningyo. 1927, the 58 friendship dolls that were sent from Japan to the children of the United States basically set the bar on quality. And I've given a number of talks on this event and its repercussions and where they are today, so I won't go into any of that today. But what I do like to do is focus on the artists, the Tokyo artists that contributed to those dolls through research that has been revealed in the archives of the Goyo family, that basically there were 9 artisans that contributed to the dolls that were supplied by Tokyo. Won't go through all of them today, but for our purposes, the top 3, which basically went on to have the most robust career within Ichimatsu, our topic of focus, are Iwamura Shokensai the first, who you've already met, and then Takizawa Koryusai too, who you've already met, and of course Hirata Goyo Nidai, of course you've already met him as well. It is these doll artisans contributed the vast majority of the dolls to the project and continued on making Ichimatsu to great acclaim, great popularity. And therefore, when I'm looking for ningyo, when I'm looking to evaluate or purchase, build collections based on Ichimatsu, these are the 3 artists that I find to be core and bedrock and necessary to develop a good rounded Ichimatsu-ningyo collection, largely because they just made awesome dolls of varying quality, but just absolutely awesome. So you can really never go wrong with a Shokensai, a Koryusai, and certainly with a Goyo. So another important artisan that I mentioned earlier is Togyoku. Togyoku came into his own in the Meiji era, a seminal maker, putting his imprint on how Ichimatsu came to be depicted and formed. This is just an amazing example by Togyoku. The sculptural quality of the face, the formation of the lips, the large set eyes, just absolutely extraordinary example. And Togyoku, quite helpfully, stamped the interior of his dolls on the signature cloth that you've seen examples of with his mark Togyoku, frequently in red like this, so very readily, easily identifiable. Now, another maker popular in the 1920s and through the 1930s up until the war years is Harukoma. I personally like this artist, particularly his large-scale pieces, and this is just a beautiful example by Harukoma, which I think captures the essence of his work. There's just a correctness to the face, almost a linear quality that I really find enjoyable. The lips a little bit narrow, almost like a bee sting lip, but I just think this is a great artisan that hasn't gotten quite as much press as, we'll say, a Togyoku or a Shokensai or Koryusai. And so Harukoma is one of those that I tend to look for, and this is a great example by Harukoma, and there is his signature and seal. Now, Okoku, I mentioned earlier, when we were going through the evaluation on faces. And so, of course, I wanted to show another one of examples here. And again, you can see just the high quality of the gofun. There's just a naturalness, variegated tones to it, a shading, a luster that I find just so extraordinary. Again, the heavy lidded eyes that he was known for, somewhat heavy in the painting in terms of how the eyebrows are rendered and the hair on the head and the lines are rendered. You'll compare that to other hair painting and you'll see that this is just quite a bit more darkly shaded. But again, just Okoku, a wonderful, wonderful artist to look for and focus on as you build your collections. You can't go wrong with an Okoku piece. And then as a final example, there's so many artists, I couldn't do all, not even close. But again, this piece by, we visited her earlier at the very beginning of the talk. This is by Hirata Yoko. This is Goyo's younger brother, who had great acclaim as an Ichimatsu-ningyo maker. And again, now looking at this doll, again, we saw it in like slide 5 or something like that. With what we've learned, when you start looking at it, you can see how the face is modeled, the naturalness of the expression, how the menso, the painting is done, the lip formation, the infeathering of the eyebrows, all of that speaks to the quality, the high qualitative level of Goyo's family, including Yoko. Yoko frequently used this seal stamp on his pieces, so I wanted to focus here or give an example of a Yoko. And then also, kind of in conclusion, Ichimatsu-ningyo continued to be a very popular form in Japan, actually all around the world. And so artisans continue to make Ichimatsu-ningyo, each bringing his and now her, because there are a number of women artists involved today, whereas back in the Meiji and Taisho and early Showa eras, there were no female practitioners of the form, but now there are. But one of the artisans that I tend to focus on is Fujimura Kokon. Now, Kokon, coincidentally, can trace his lineage into the Koryusai lineage, and I'll be doing more of an exploration on him in another talk. But Fujimura Kokon, for my money at this point, is perhaps the best Ichimatsu-ningyo maker in Japan because of the way he works gofun, because of the quality of the textiles that he employs. This was him giving a demonstration at Yoshitoku when I took my tour there a couple of years ago. This photograph by Stephanie Blythe, who sat front row to watch him as he was showing how, and he's about to put hair on this doll. But it's him at work, a beautiful example. But on display there at Yoshitoku were some of his works, and you can tell that he takes a sort of it's traditional, but also different, tying more into maybe the impish component of manga and anime today, but the quality level of the gofun, his skill set in carving, and then the textiles he employed, top notch without any question. And therefore, I like to focus on Fujimura Kokon as a maker of note, a contemporary maker of note, and we will be seeing ningyo from him for many, many years to come, as well as his deshi and disciples as they go independent. So Fujimura Kokon. So a lot of this information is contained in my book, Ichimatsu, Japanese Play Dolls, plus a lot more. So I encourage you to look into that. Again, available on my website or through Amazon. And also, while you're at it, you want to stock up on the library, a number of books that go into Japanese doll history in general, or Art as Ambassador, my full-throated paean to the friendship doll movement, sort of a robust 560-page book there in the middle, and then also Japanese Dolls, The Fascinating World of Ningyo, something of an introduction to the various types of dolls. So I encourage you to look at that if you find Ningyo of interest and you want to delve a little bit deeper. So again, this has been Notes on Ningyo. It's an ongoing video series that I post on YouTube. Please continue to look for it. Up to now, this is the 16th edition, so this gives you a sampling of some of our previous editions of Notes on Ningyo. A wide variety of topics, ranging from, of course, the friendship dolls to Gosho Ningyo to Iki Ningyo to costume dolls of the 18th century, just all over the place. So hopefully you'll spend time looking at these videos just to immerse yourself a little bit more in Ningyo culture, and stay tuned within the next month or so. I hope to have another one, and that will be Notes on Ningyo episode 17, and I'm going to do a very deep dive into Takizawa Koryusai and his lineage and work and history. But again, till then, my name is Alan Scott Pate, and hopefully you can visit my website at antiquejapanesedolls.com, Facebook, Alan Scott Pate Antique Japanese Dolls, and of course I have an Instagram account and all the usual suspects. So please look for me online. But until then, again, this has been Alan Scott Pate, Notes on Ningyo. I hope you've enjoyed this little adventure on how to evaluate Ichimatsu-ningyo, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you.